All right. Hello, everybody. I think this is a better way to meet than to drive to campus or walk across campus. Some of those sidewalks are nasty and the roads are really bad. I think what we can do is hold off on the topic ideas for next class. And today, just watch this video. I'll be as brief as possible. But I want to talk to you about quantitative and qualitative approaches to research and just sort of touch the surface. I'm not going to get into any really specific approaches and methodologies, but what I want to tell you about is sort of what they are, how we can do them in general, and then when we would use one or the other or both. So we'll do that with quantitative, qualitative, and then at the end, just touch on mixed methods. And I really see that on a spectrum because some mixed methods are very quantitative heavy with a little dash of qualitative or vice versa, while others are much more balanced. So let's start out with a quantitative approach. So what is that? Really, what you're doing with a quantitative approach is measuring variables, if you'll see the screen there, and looking for relationships between them in order to explain phenomena. So let me define all that for you. So variables, this is what is being measured. I'll give you examples of this as we go, but you've all heard of independent or dependent variables. That's what we're referring to here with quantitative data. And the easy way to remember that, if you don't know, would be independent variables impact or act upon other variables, and those that are dependent, their measurement is dependent on how it interacts with the independent variable. So independent variables are not changed in research, but dependent variables are often changed. That's what we're trying to see, if there is a change in the dependent variable based on which independent one we use. Now, if we look for those relationships, you're going to hear those described a couple ways, but really it's just when two or more variables have some sort of an interaction. Later on, we'll call that a main effect or an interaction, and that will depend on the number of variables that are being involved. But generally speaking, a positive relationship, it's nothing about healthy relationships. It just means that when things change, when one variable changes, the other variable changes in the same direction. They're positively related in that way. If both go up, then that's just what happens. They go up. If one goes up and the other goes down, that's called a negative relationship. That's when things go in different directions. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. But the last word there to understand is phenomena, what is observed or experienced. So let's think of it sort of this way. First of all, whenever I am putting together my research picture, if you will, sort of thinking about what I want to study and how, I like to, as Missy Elliott says, flip it and reverse it. So I like to work up. So first, what am I studying? Well, for example, the example I'll run with was my dissertation a few years back, and that is instructor use of slang in the classroom. I noticed that sometimes when I was in a classroom, I would use slang and get good responses, smiles, sort of laughs in a positive way. Other times, people would give me these strange looks, and I wanted to know how students were I guess, in perceiving my use of slang. And so, what I was looking for was the relationship between my use of slang and students' perceptions of that slang. So, my use of slang is the independent variable, as you'll see here. And then the student's perception of that is the dependent variable. And I go further there. I say I was really concerned with specifically how they thought about me in terms of credibility, approachability, and dynamism, or willing to spend energy to accomplish a goal like teaching. So we'll come back to these examples in a few minutes and talk about some differences. Actually, let me just run back here. But this would be a very clean study in terms of looking at how I do something and how it's responded to. So if that was a positive relationship, for example, as I use more slang, students would like it more. Now, with most relationships like that, there's a cutoff point. And that's something that we're not going to get into in this class, but we're just looking for those general relationships between the variables. Now, When we think more broadly about quantitative approaches, remember a few things. First of all, we're focused on numeric data. This could be a raw measurement if you're looking at physical things, so age and height. Those are usually a positive relationship. But you can just put in age by years, height by whatever you like, centimeters, inches, feet, yards, meters. And we'll see that they have a positive relationship, right? So, but that's that numeric data. Now, other things are still very measurable, like anxiety levels and communication levels. We can simply see how folks report their anxiety at any time. You know, they feel more or less anxious at a given moment. And then we can see if there's more or less communication happening. So if you're familiar with theories at all from in comm theory, you'll know this is referring to, uncertainty reduction theory. So the more communication happens, usually the less anxiety we feel, at least the less uncertainty we feel. Doesn't mean that we feel good about things. It just maybe that we're very certain we feel bad about them. Now, for most of us, we're going to code non-numeric data into numeric data. And this is where we use things like Likert scales. So those will be statements, so when I go shopping, I look for name brands, always, sometimes, often, never, that kind of stuff, right? And so then we can code that into a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever we have, and we can run the statistical analysis on it in the same way. Speaking of some terms that we'll use for stats, that kind of went to a different approach than I thought it would, but that's okay. Here, what I want to focus on for a minute are really the two ways that you would use a quantitative approach, and that is the experimental design and or a survey. Again, I mentioned early in this video, we're not going to do a lot of detail with this, but what I'll simply say is an experimental design is what you sort of probably imagine it to be. It's two or more similar groups trying to test a treatment or a stimulus. So you've got at least two groups. One would be the control group. This is the group that does not get exposed to whatever the stimulus or treatment is. And the experimental group they are exposed to the treatment or the stimulus. Now, the reason that experimental design is favored by many is that it's very controllable. It's in a laboratory setting usually. You can control the temperature, the amount of people, the words that are used. Everything is really a well-designed science project at that point. And so it's really got its strength in that way. Also, we use pre and post tests to measure the impact of a reaction to the treatment or the stimulus. So if you think about an example, still thinking about that slang example, I would have two groups of students, and I would begin them both with an introduction video. I thought about doing my project like this, but I did not. So in this case, I would have made a video with an instructor. In this case, it was Dr. Wendy Atkinsayer. And she would have simply given like a 2-minute spiel on herself. Hi, this is who I am. This is my background. This is what I teach. This is what I do. Have a great day. Then those students, every student, no matter what group they're in, control or experimental, would have taken the pretest. And you see that down at the very bottom. Questions about credibility, approachability, and dynamism. I'll come back to that scales idea in a minute. But you would give these folks that survey, and then the control group would be done. They would be finished. They don't need to really see anything else. Now, the experimental group would be exposed to that same instructor, that same person, giving a class talk, like again, a 2-minute snippet, but this time using slang. So that would be the inclusion of that stimulus. Then at the end of that, those folks would be asked the same questions. You can mix up the order if you want, about credibility, approachability, and dynamism. And the idea would be, first, to test the two pre-tests to make sure that they are similar. There should not be a significant difference between them. Then to test the control group's test versus the post-test of the experimental group. And then if there is a significant difference between those, we could say it can be attributed to the second video and the slang that's in there. If you wanted to be even more controlling, you would show both groups 2 videos. But the control group would get a 2-minute snippet of a class talk without slang, and then the same questions again. It's really important in these situations, as I've mentioned, to control as many variables as possible. So here, this was a script with, she wasn't a professional actor, she's a professor, but of course acting in that role. And then also, when I was going to make these videos, I would need to use the exact same location, the exact same outfit, the exact same hair placement. You would want to do these recordings right after one another, back to back, if you would. That way you can avoid what's known as idiosyncratic effects. So this is just for, let's say she wore her reading glasses in one and then took them off for the other. That could make all the difference in the responses, but we wouldn't know that if we didn't control for it. So we might see that, oh, wow, folks really didn't like it when she used slang, but oh, that's also where she used her reading glasses. So maybe the combination or just the glasses made the difference. We can't know because we didn't control for that. So you have the most control in an experimental design. You also, though, have a lot of control in a survey. And most of the way we do survey in social science could be almost considered what's known as quasi-experimental. And I'll explain that here. But first, a survey, as you know, would be asking questions about people's attitudes, beliefs, values, and trying to measure those or the likelihood of their behaviors. There's theories out there like the theory reasoned of action or the behavior likelihood model, where we can use your attitudes and beliefs and values to predict your behaviors to some accuracy. But what I'll say about this is when we do much more of the coding. And this isn't a hard process. I'll help you with this as we get closer. But just so we're clear on this, if I say survey or questionnaire, it can mean the same thing. It's an either or. Question versus item. If you say there's 50 items on the survey or 50 questions on the survey, it's really depending on, is it a real list of questions or are there some statements in there? Again, using those Likert, or actually Likert is what it's called, scales, to respond to. So if that's the case, you would go with items, just to be correct. And then this one's important, scale versus instrument. So a scale measures one thing. So for example, in the example I just gave you, I looked at credibility, approachability, and dynamism. There is a scale for credibility. There is a scale for approachability, and there is a scale for dynamism. If you put them all on one form or one, Qualtrics survey or whatever, piece of paper, then you have an instrument which has multiple scales. And no matter what kind of scale or instrument you use, you want to make sure it's reliable and valid. More on that later, but the quick version is it's repeatable and it's accurate. So it's measuring what you intend to measure in a consistent way. And then last, you will always want to collect as much demographic information as possible on your surveys. Even if it's maybe overkill, it's better to have too much than too little and then need more. So let's look at an example of this. This is what I did for my dissertation, as a matter of fact. But surveys, I had clear directions on my survey for whoever received it to imagine an instructor that I described. And so it was, all the demographic things you would imagine: age, gender, ethnicity. There was education level, their rank, if they were an assistant professor, a full professor, an adjunct, that kind of thing. All that I could think of. And then there were multiple versions of the survey. Now, the questions were all the same. So let me be clear on that. But what I used was a text box, basically, at the top of my survey where I had a transcript, as it was supposed to be a transcript, of a professor that I just described using slang. And the surveys varied because some versions had all the same questions, of course, for everything, but some had different amounts of slang there, and others had different descriptions of the professor that I was asking them to imagine. I wanted to see if there was a baseline difference between the way people sort of thought about the appropriateness of slang based on someone's demographic data. Turns out there is. But again, I use questions and items. I had those 3 scales that I talked to you about. However, some of them were long. So like the credibility scales, like 28 items, something like that. I didn't have room or a desire to ask people 28 items for one thing and then 15 more for another and then 21 for the third. So, instead of doing that, I cherry picked things that I thought would be best, the items I thought would be best from those existing scales. And then I had to, as you see the next thing there, use the partial scales and double check my reliability and validity. So if you decide that you want to use existing scales, you can definitely do that. If it's one, that's fine, go with it. If you need more than one, we can make that work to sort of chop them up and put them together in a couple different ways, then test to see if they are still useful. So don't worry about that being sort of a block for you. If you're like, Carl, this sounds kind of complicated. Maybe I'll just interview people. If this is going to be a better approach to your work, use this, and of course, I'll help you get through it. Last but not least, I collected all the demographic info, and it turns out that men can use slang as professors much longer in life than can women and still be seen as credible, approachable, and dynamic. And male students who see female professors use slang are the least approving, for what that's worth. So, last thing on quantitative approach, why would we use this? Well, lots of reasons, but large amounts of data would be one reason. It's hard to pour through, 10,000 interviews, but if you have 10,000 surveys and a good computer program, you can make that an afternoon. You can also standardize data. So if, let's say I did a study of slang, I did it the same way, but I did it at 50 different universities, then I would now have this sort of standardized approach, same questions, same measurements, as opposed to leaving it up to individual researchers at these different locations to hopefully ask my questions the right way and do the right follow-ups and the things that qualitative approaches would use. Another big reason to do this kind of research is because in big populations, you get a lot of predictive power. So the more people that are included in a study, the more generalizable you can say things are. And for a study like this one, it would help instructors make a strategic choice about the use of slang. But right now, I can only say that about students in Michigan and Mississippi. So, that's a little bit less than useful for the other 48 states. Another good reason for quantitative data, numbers, is because it's easy to track changes over time and identify trends and needs. So if things are changing, it might take a longer time for that to come out in an interview setting over 50 years of different people and, let's say, college students than it would to have their immediate response through a survey and see that on a trend line and the shift, right? So it can be easier to identify trends and see things faster. It's also an easy way to check for interactions between different variables. So again, it'll help you control for those, they're called lurking or confounding variables, but things that cause problems because they weren't controlled for. Quantitative work helps you eliminate that or at least minimize it. And I'll say this at the end of this section. Quantitative data and information is great because it helps you understand what is happening. We'll see that next. The qualitative approach can help you understand why it's happening and how it's being sort of perceived, but what is happening is the answer we get with most quantitative work. Before I go on to the next slide, if you're still hanging with me, thank you very much. Again, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but if you come into class on Thursday and at the very beginning of class, walk up with a piece of paper with your name on it that just has on the piece of paper a star, just a star and your name on it. Bring that up to me and you get a point on your final grade because I know you watched the video. Moving on, the qualitative approach, even as it says here, no regrets. All right. So the qualitative approach, this is a much shorter section, by the way. What is it? Well, it's collecting observations and reports now to explain a phenomena. We're not measuring things in the same way. We're looking for observations or firsthand witnesses or witnessing of phenomena. So these are people who were impacted. They were exposed to something. These, by the way, can be made, observations can be made by a researcher or participants. Often in qualitative approaches, the researcher becomes a participant. So this is like, the extreme example is like undercover, reporter or detective work. You're part of the motorcycle gang or whatever it is. And that's how you're getting in there and making observations. It could also be that, you go to the mall and you're watching kids play at the little play area and you want to see how boys and girls interact and who initiates contact first more. I don't know, making it up, right? Communication through play. And you want to just observe. You can watch that as well, or you could go with reports. And so these are the witness accounting of phenomenon. This could be written or oral. Again, if it's the mall thing, you might just ask parents about what they've noticed. You might talk to the kids if you get IRB approval, which you probably won't for talking to kids. It's really hard, which it should be. But this is where, you can really hear from people. This is your traditional interviews, but it could also be historic or written accounts that are sort of documented somewhere. If you're looking at things from the past, or if you want to understand someone's experience with something you're dealing with, but you're separated by space. Of course, those things can be useful as well. And the phenomena is the same. It's what is observed or experienced. So if we think about slang in the classroom, the observations would be finding students who have observed it, right? We want to get people who have observed it, or we might sit in on some classes and observe it ourselves. The reports would be when we ask those students, boy, what do you think about professors using slang in the classroom? You could do individual interviews. You could hold focus groups to discuss what they've experienced. You might do something recorded, but always get permission for that. Or you might do a note-heavy interview. We'll have all those details will come later as we talk about more specific methods. Or my preferred approach to quote-unquote interviews is email interviews. And this is when you can send interview questions and have folks respond to them in text. The bonus is that you're going to have a lot less to do in terms of transcribing and reviewing tapes. The downside is folks may not be as honest or forthcoming with you because they know that there's a written record. But for most of our topics, that won't be an issue anyway. That's when we get into really sensitive material. So how does this work? Well, here's the short of it. We're going to get all those observations and those accounts of what happened. We're going to put them together. We're going to look for what are known as emergent themes. So these are ideas, descriptions, characterizations, things like that participants mention frequently. So if we're looking at slang and we have a group of, let's say 20 people we're interviewing, and folks consistently say that it is annoying. That's the word. Annoying or bothersome or in some way undesirable for professors to use slang. Well, that would be something we'd want to see as a theme, right? So if that's one that came out, great. Then what we would do is go back in and see where that was brought up in terms of did participants agree that it was always annoying, or did they say things like, it's so annoying when they don't use slang, right? So we want to see where they agree, where they disagree. The way to do that is through really looking closely at the responses, thinking about contexts. It's not always what's said, but maybe sometimes how it's said. You could go as far as to really dissect the responses and try to break things down and take as much information as you can from it. Or you can do sort of, we'll see it in just a moment, this analysis where you're just trying to find things that pop a lot. And then you can later try to make an educated assumption or guess about what the outcomes of those things might be. If needed, you could then go back and re-interview the same folks and ask them what they think it might be. So you might plan to do this, or it could be emergent. Again, that is something that happens sort of naturally in the field where you just didn't think people were going to bring something up, but they did. So you might even start asking that question that you didn't plan just to see where people are on that issue. At the very bottom here, you're going to see a list of methodological approaches. The short version of this is that narrative approach is going to be when you try to understand a phenomenon from one point of view. So, for example, the student in the classroom with the professor who uses slang. What was it like to be there? The phenomenological approach is that plus one more thing. It adds in other people who may be a stakeholder or play a role in that phenomena. So now, obviously, you've talked to the students, but you would then talk to the professors who do or do not use slang and figure out why. Maybe talk to administrators and see what they think about instructors, professors who use slang. Maybe do a split between alumni and current students. Again, you're trying to get a lot of different views instead of just that one that narrative goes for. The wording is phenomenological research tries to capture the essence of an experience, and that's getting it from all angles. The ethnographic approach is much like that undercover that we were talking about. It doesn't have to be. You could be already a part of a group, but maybe not. Maybe you want to study a particular group, but you're not a member of. In this case, you would need to find someone to let you in that group. We'll call them a gatekeeper. And then you would decide on how you would collect information. Would you do it sort of openly, publicly? Would you talk about it? Would you be sneaky? Would you try to stay with some sort of cover? There's different ways to do it, different ethics to consider, but it's getting into a group and studying how they communicate in our case. And then last, a case study. This is any bound example. So this is a case. It could be like the Challenger disaster and what went wrong with the communication. It could be a class that you were a part of that had a particular interesting element that you want to discuss or study. There's lots of ways to do the case studies. Case study is also where these two worlds, quantitative and qualitative, kind of come together. But before we get to that, the reason we would do qualitative work or choose it over quantitative is because it will give us a much deeper and richer understanding of what's happening. Again, as I mentioned before, we can figure out what's going on, but this, as you see at the bottom, qualitative, helps us understand why and how what's happening is going on. So we can really use it in unique situations, either that's small numbers or subgroups. And what I mean there is we can make generalized predictions about human behavior, but what about a specific group of humans? Is it different there? Can we understand and study that? This approach, qualitative, also helps you do a better job explaining perceptions people have and why, capturing feelings and emotions that they might have and that numbers just can't quite put justice to, maybe. And you're going to get much more vivid descriptions and contextualizations of the events and phenomena. That, again, the numbers, unless we ask specific questions, there's no room for new things to come up in quantitative information, in quantitative research. And so this emergent element of qualitative work is very valuable in many situations. So let's just do a quick comparison. Quantitative, you're going to use numeric or coded data. Qualitative, it's personal accounts and descriptions. To gain that information, you're going, in a quantitative setting, to conduct an experiment or create and administer a survey. Or qualitatively, you're going to make observations, ask for observation reports, or conduct interviews. When we get that data we need, either way, quantitatively, we're going to run a statistic analysis. And again, if you've not done that before, that kind of freaks you out, don't worry about it. I'm here to help with that as well. But if you do something qualitative, you're going to look for emergent themes and you're going to compare them over and over again. Again, quantitative data will tell you what's happening, but qualitative can explain much better why and how something is happening. But last, not least, mixed methods. So if you think about this as a continuum and let's say there's quantitative heavy mixes on one side and qualitative heavy on the other, think of it this way. So if you're quantitative heavy, you might want to use a survey, but you need to know what questions to ask. And so to do that, you might put together a small focus group and ask them for some feedback in terms of what questions you might prepare. You might come in with a few, see what they think, do a little testing, ask for their own thoughts on what they think they should be asked about a particular topic, put all that together, and now you've got a pretty decent survey, I hope. On the other end, if you're very qualitative, you might, for example, count the number of times a person curses when telling a story and see if there's a correlation between that and the type of story they tell or their background or their gender or whatever you're looking for. But this is what we see a lot in case studies. So, for example, if you're trying to compare media outlets and you want to see how they cover immigration, especially southern border immigration, and you want to compare the number of uses of terms like undocumented immigrants or illegal alien, and you want to, arrive at a conclusion based on that language use. That's another way that you would use this light quantitative work sprinkled with your qualitative analysis. Or maybe you're right in the middle, and this is what I'm actually working on right now, where I am going to send out a survey to a very small group, like 50 people, because these are communication center directors, and I'm going to ask them in a survey to give me some information about the types of partnerships they have at their communication center. From that, I will choose who I think would be the best fit for a on-campus site visit, and then I'll go there, make my own observations, and then after I've made my observations, not before, that's important to me, I will interview folks and get their take on things. I do it that way because I don't want their input to sway my observations. And so this is, again, very carefully planned. It's very involved. It's going to take a long time, which is why I get a semester off to do it, if everything goes well. So you can use a little, you can use a lot of one style or the other, but mixed methods, it's much more common than many people think, but I don't want you to try to do everything and try to go right down the middle and do double the work. It's not what we're here for. And you can give me very quality, useful, important work without doing all that. All right, that's the end of that. If you have questions, let me know via email. Otherwise, I will see you Thursday. Make sure to bring in your topic and your feedback and anything else that might be due. I'll see you then. Check the syllabus before you come in, and I will talk to you then. Thanks.